Hello, geographers. This A-level case study looks at the 2004 Boxing Day Tsunami. It fits into the specification in relation to seismic hazards. So the nature of seismicity and its relation to plate tectonics. And obviously it's an example of a tsunami, the worst tsunami that actually has been in human history. So the location of it is off the coast of Banda Aceh in Indonesia. 256 kilometers off the coast is where the epicenter was found, and you can see it located just here. So here you've got Indonesia, Australia to the south, and then Thailand, Myanmar, Bangladesh, India to the north. And you can see its plate tectonic setting just here. So you've got the Indo-Australian plate subducting underneath the Eurasian plate. But you also have the triple junction here with the Philippine plate and the Pacific plate playing a role too. So these are some of the causes we know in the general information. We know it was on the 26th of December, Boxing Day 2004. We know that it occurred in the Indian Ocean. We know that the Indo-Australian plate subducted below the Eurasian plate. It was a magnitude 9 on the Richter scale. The earthquake caused the seafloor to uplift, which is what caused the displacement of the water, creating a tsunami. And that tsunami measured less than 1 meter high in open water with a very large wavelength. Traveled at speeds up to 800 kilometers per hour. When it reached the shore, the wave increased to 15 meters, and in lots of areas. The high population density caused major casualties. The hot climate means disease and lack of sanitation is a contributor to the death toll here. The focus depth of 30 kilometers below the sea level, so 10 kilometers below the seabed, is actually a very shallow focus. And we know that it's a destructive plate boundary between that Indo-Australian plate beneath the Burma plate, 6 centimeters a year. So there were several effects, socioeconomic and environmental. 250,000 people died. 2 million people were made homeless. People were swept away in the waters, which arrived rapidly and with little warning. There was no warning system in place, so they just didn't know that it was coming. Bangladesh was not badly affected despite being closest and low-lying. Kulatara in Sri Lanka was badly hit with villages and tourist resorts flooded on the coast. The Indian state of Kerala was hit despite the shield of Sri Lanka due to the refraction of waves. PP Island was decimated. Aceh province was most badly hit because we know it was closest to the epicenter. And many populations on the coast were taken by surprise due to the lack of that tsunami warning system. They couldn't afford the system even though meteorologists in Thailand had suggested that they had one. And the death toll was 170,000 in Indonesia alone and reached 235,000 overall. 1.7 million people were displaced. The economic effects, let me just move that out of the way, such as places like Maldives had to rebuild their industries. They rely on tourism. Many communities affected were dependent on the fishing industry, which employed 250,000 people. 66% of the fishing fleet was lost, really badly hit in Sri Lanka and Thailand. There was a real loss of tourism. People were not returning. And farming industry couldn't operate as obviously the irrigation was difficult. The fields had been swamped by salt water, so there was salinization of crops. Then you had these environmental impacts. The mangrove swamps helped to act as a barrier to reduce the energy of the water in some areas. Mangroves had been removed in a lot of the areas that were really badly affected. Those coastal ecosystems were destroyed, and many more, obviously, ecosystems were polluted by that mixing of the chemical waste in the floodwater, and this arable land was covered in a layer of salt and it became infertile. But short-term management, so there was short-term aid like water purification tablets, temporary housing, medical supplies were given from international countries. Huge amounts of humanitarian aid were required and sent to those affected areas. $14 billion was provided in total, and lots of aid came from lots of organisations. The US provided search and rescue as well. Refugee camps were set up and clinics were set up by overseas aid workers like Médecins Sans Frontières. The longer term management, it now has an early warning system that's been set up by the countries surrounding the Indian Ocean. There's been development, research into earthquakes, tsunami management, warning systems and drills. The corruption has slowed aid efforts. They've tried to perhaps resolve some of that. The tsunami warning system has been implemented in Thailand. 4,500 troops were mobilised to Singapore to help with recovery, and the wealthier nations like UK, as you know, provided donations for reconstruction and development. Now, if you wanted to give this some practice, it would come into this. The impact of seismic hazards is influenced by the level of development of the place affected. To what extent do you agree with this view? So you could use this because obviously it's a seismic hazard, and you could compare it in relation to those countries with varying degrees of levels of development. Let's see, have a look at the mark scheme. You can pause it here or look at the mark scheme before and then answer. It's entirely up to you. So looking at AO1 and AO2, you know it's split 10-10. So having that understanding about seismic hazards and the characteristic human responses, the distribution and the long-term and short-term responses. And then obviously the AO2, evaluating that and analysing it and looking at this as well. That evaluation is really important to look at the scale of the impact following a hazard. And you can see here the Indian Ocean here is the Indian Ocean, the Boxing Day Tsunami, as an event which triggered wide-ranging and severe impacts across many countries, not least due to the scale of the event. So looking at attitudes, so perception, and also how, you know, those vary in relation to wealth. So going back, the level of development of the place affected. Have a go at that question and then see if you can mark your answer.